Okay, so a lot of the content on this channel tackles video game information and guides, but today I want to do an analysis of certain factors on the development side of games that cause it to be one of the most brutal employment fields out there. I don't mean brutal in terms of literal physical toll or danger, but in general, the profession is both highly taxing and also riddled with traps and pitfalls, turning it into one of the harder lines of work that I have seen. We as gamers often either forget or willfully ignore this fact, especially in times of general frustration, which is kind of understandable, but it felt deserving of a video, especially in light of some recent events. Many may already be aware of the abrupt closing of Telltale Games. The studio was responsible for a great many beloved titles and recently had even been taking on a very prolific approach, which in some ways bolstered an atmosphere of relative success. But the inverse was in fact true, which became painfully clear very suddenly. They released this statement right here through Twitter on September 21st, 2018, which confirmed that the studio was shutting down, firing all but 25 of its employees, and it was later learned that the laid-off developers would not be receiving severance. There has since been a class action lawsuit opened against the company, and I wish all of the affected developers the best of luck, but it remains to be seen how all that will unfold. Anyways, this serves as a fresh reminder for some, or for many, a laid bare glimpse into the struggles that game developers endure to produce some of the products that we know and love. Speaking a bit about another area where I have personal experience, while developing the channel originally, and specifically focusing on Tom Clancy's The Division, I was invited to participate in an event called the Elite Task Force, which brought me inside massive entertainment in Malmo, Sweden. While there, I started to see some of the inner workings and got a more detailed snapshot of the communication process and the sheer scope of some of the AAA games that we see released nowadays. Things like stealth nerfs, which is a term used to describe changes which decrease the power of items or gear or mechanics in a game that are not articulated to the player base beforehand, were something that up till that point I had been extremely critical of and very vocal about it to boot. Upon getting an up-and-close personal look, however, at the inner workings, it became clear that stealth nerfs, while annoying, are not some malignant act. It's just a small, very tiny breakdown in one or two of the hundreds, if not thousands, of communications that happen each and every day. I also became more aware of the sheer amount of hours logged by developers, even regarding tasks that players like myself, up till that point, had thought to be trivial. Since deadlines and expectations are set in a top-down fashion, most often by a financially dominant publisher, developers must sometimes crunch hours in an obscene dash to the finish line. This type of work atmosphere might be perfectly reasonable if the pay scale and job security justified it, but the reality is that there is clearly next to no job security, and the pay scale, at least by my research, is not even close to what it should be. The employees of Telltale Games, except for the 25 that are remaining on board to finish what clearly must be just a contractual obligation with some third-party company, or they would have been canned too, are not receiving severance despite untold overtime work for projects, some of which will now never even be completed. Simply put, wasted time and artistic vision without even a shred of compensation for a portion of it. As if that were not enough, now it's time to talk about us, the frequently outraged gaming community. I include myself within that group for obvious reasons. I fit that definition to the letter, though I like to think that it is for appropriate reasons and to an appropriate scale. But anyways, this is not universally true of every games community or every player, though I would hazard a guess that most actual gamers at one point or another have fallen into this category. We as a community can often become enraged in a heartbeat, and all too often I have seen that frustration misdirected at developers through social media and other outlets. Debate and feedback is healthy, but blind antagonistic harassment is not, and unfortunately, this is most certainly present in some game communities, especially when developers make changes or other modifications that players adamantly disagree with. Worse yet, this type of animosity can occur when errors, glitches, or other breakdowns in a game's code affect a player's enjoyment, and that is an area in which I myself am absolutely guilty of overreacting. I've never taken it to social media to harass some random developer who may not even be involved at all, but I've seen overly judgmental people and been an overly judgmental person myself before, to say the very least. Game developers are faced with the struggle of juggling deadlines, overtime, complex assignments, and other technical responsibilities with possible backlash over functionality, glitches, and balancing. Still further, there is another type of backlash, as well as a possible set of evolving expectations from within that make the development process even more difficult. This is where we get into the political side of things, so for anyone who wants to tune out and run back to their safe space, now would obviously be the time. To be clear, the political difficulty does not affect every game, but for the games it does impact, it hits pretty hard. The first of the problems stems from top-down marketing decisions based around pointed social justice or inclusion standards, or any number of other agendas that get pigeonholed into a game from inception. Again, this is not indicative of every game that releases, but when it's there, it's pretty obvious. The second area where this tears down gaming narratives is the decisive push to avoid offending anyone. Some games entirely avoid this and often reap sales off of the controversy, but some companies play right into the sensitivity culture that has been evolving by outright censoring certain content that could or might be offensive. But the real issue is that they have this expanding, malleable, and ridiculous list of possibilities for both what could be offensive and whom it could offend. Imagine it like a group project for a school paper. You get an assignment to write a short story about, let's say, World War II. It sounds pretty cool, right? Powerful subject matter, room for creativity, etc. But then the teacher goes on to say, in this story, you need to include one man, one woman, one sea creature, one of every single ethnicity. You need to make sure to include certain keywords so people know that this class has a certain set of principles and beliefs. You can't offend anyone, so you have to avoid topics like Nazis, even though it's World War II, because Nazis can trigger people, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on. Now that all of these prerequisites are established, you can get to work writing the paper. You and your group do your best, but with all the different things you had to either include or leave out, it ends up not being a very fun read. It's okay, but with all the hoops you had to jump through, it just doesn't grip the reader. It's not bad, but it is far from an accurate portrayal of the war, and trends more towards a transparent political stance. The analogy's not over, bear with me here. Then it's time to present your paper for a final grade. You all get up in front of the class and you start to read, knowing full well that if the teacher does not like it, you will fail. But also that if even just a few of the wrong classmates dislike it, they will run a scorched earth campaign against you that follows you well outside the classroom. Additionally, if either the class or the teacher don't like it because it did not fit their expectation of a properly written story that includes all the right characters, they could very well press for your termination at work, or in the case of the teacher, fire you outright. Basically, if the wrong people think you did a bad job, including all the required things, you may get hit just as hard as if you had ignored all of the guidelines and not included any of them. And that group of unfortunate people are vocal as all hell and have a constantly warping perception of what is socially acceptable or condemnable, which means you have no hope of understanding long enough to write a paper you know will get a good grade. It's not every game and it's not every company, and even when all of these requirements are forced on a title, it does not guarantee it will fail. We still find beautifully crafted narratives like God of War, for instance, but there are certain groups pushing as hard as they can to control the narrative at every turn and hold up a checklist to it that can stifle creativity. And if it does stifle the creativity, they then rake the developers and the writers back over the coals the opposite way because they failed the delusional test. Before anyone jumps in and starts throwing around phrases like alt-right or extremist, slow down just a little bit. The simple fact that someone does not agree with you, or more commonly in this case, since how passionate the SJW crowd has become, does not agree as strongly, that does not immediately turn them into some antithesis alt-right demon. If I were in a personal social setting and someone said, hey, I really don't agree with your points of view on this, that, or the other thing, and could you please not talk about that or address me in a certain way or what have you, I would almost 100% of the time absolutely oblige, and I would likely apologize if I did legitimately and justifiably offend them. Not some made up snowflake I'm offended crap though. But if someone approaches me, or most others for that matter, in a social setting, and likewise this extends into a production environment as well, where writers and other game developers are crafting a story and developing its mechanics, and they start off with, if you don't think the same thing as me or advertise those beliefs as loudly, you're alt-right, you're misogynistic, you're toxically masculine, and blah, blah, blah. You have to include these things and those things, and if you don't, I'm going to try to get you fired and ruin your life and your future based on mere speculation because you don't fit in with what I believe the whole world needs to think and act like. If someone leads with that right there, or goes down that road at any point, on principle, I just don't want to be around them, or agree with them, or do anything that they want me to. Now imagine if this were coming from the top down, which is not always the case, but it definitely can be, and you or I were obligated to actually do the things and implement the features that the finger-wagging person was yelling in our face. I wouldn't try as hard. It'd get done, but it would be mediocre. not even consciously, but when you are told to do something by someone disrespectful and annoying, at least personally, I automatically want to do it less. And subconsciously, I probably do a worse job of it too. The stark comparison between Kingdom Come Deliverance and Call of Duty World War II is the best example of all of this. On the one hand, Kingdom Come Deliverance was created and sold as historically accurate and set in 15th century Bohemia, but then it was called racist because they accurately did not include any race other than white people. Call of Duty presented a World War II narrative that jumped through all of the hoops it possibly could to pacify as many crowds as possible, and got condemned because it felt tokenistic and disingenuous. I did a whole video on that topic if you want to check it out. I'll link it down below. It's a bit older, but it's still one of the best comparisons because the events happen so close to one another. Basically, developers face a horde of meddling parties, checklists, and requirements, and difficulties in general that make their job much harder than necessary. Tack all of that on top of insane hours, little to no job security, and communities on a hair trigger for a variety of reasons, from actual game performance to politics, and you have a career path that is beyond brutal. Some people may disagree and say that Telltale Games closing is an anomaly, but examples extend far beyond that one studio. Some time ago, EA shut down Visceral Games in a very sudden move, with the primary cause being a reduction in their emphasis on single-player games and a more intense focus on games as a service and paid loot boxes and microtransactions. Some of my favorite games in existence have been single-player action RPGs, and that sort of top-down, purely profit-driven decision really sucks to see, because a well-crafted single-player Star Wars game might have been phenomenal. The video I did regarding SJW culture ruining gaming from a while ago did not paint the full picture. I still stand by it, but there's more to the story. Social justice manufactured outrage is absolutely contributing to the detriment of certain games, but so too are predatory monetization practices that are forced through by executives and then implemented by developers under obligation, and then negatively impact the consumers. Shutting down studios that are working on more artfully crafted games in favor of generic greed and stagnation is also detrimental, as is laying off talented writers and developers without severance. Community backlash against the wrong people for the wrong reasons also comes into play, and it's a combination of all of these things that makes being a game developer in the current climate specifically extremely brutal. That's going to wrap it up for today's video. I made a joking shirt design a long time ago and it did really well, and way more people than I thought were interested in it. So in the same vein, I did these ones right here. It might be a little bit on the nose, but honestly, subtlety has never been a strong suit of mine, so here they are. They're like social barometers, if you will. If someone gets outraged by this, it's the perfect indicator that they are way over the top and not worth hanging out with, and it's linked in the description down below. If you want to support the channel in other ways or join the communities, check out other links in the description. We have a Facebook group, Discord server, I live stream once in a while, whole bunch of things, but I'll call it there and let you decide for yourself. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a nice night.